I've seen too many people rush to grab the cheapest mirrorless they can find, only to end up with a camera that freezes halfway through a birthday party or produces grainy video when the lights go low. That buyer's regret is real, and it makes you wonder if spending a little more on a name-brand full-frame body is actually a smarter move. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When I started looking at entry-level full-frame options, the Sony A7 kept popping up. It's the first Sony camera that gave hobbyists a true 35mm size sensor without the hefty price tag of the newer models. The big question is whether the trade-offs: an older autofocus engine, no in-body stabilization, and a menu that can feel like a maze are worth the jump from a crop sensor kit to a full-frame platform. If you're the type of shooter who has been stuck on a APS-C or Micro Four Thirds system and you're itching for that shallow depth-of-field look, the A7 can be a game-changer. The 24-megapixel sensor captures that creamy bokeh you've only seen in higher-priced cameras, and the dynamic range is generous enough that you can pull detail out of shadows in post-processing without turning the image into a mushy mess. For portrait work, the results are consistently more three-dimensional than what you'd get from a 20-megapixel crop sensor. The autofocus is where the A7 shows its age. Sony equipped it with 117 phase detect points, which was impressive when the camera launched, but today it feels a step behind the hybrid systems on the newer A7 III or A7 IV. In bright daylight the focus locks quickly enough for casual street photography, but if you try to track a moving subject, say a kid running across a park or a cyclist in a city street, the focus can hunt and occasionally miss the mark. That's not a deal-breaker for static subjects, but it's a clear weakness if you need reliable subject tracking for sports or wildlife. Low-light performance is where the A7 shines more than it hurts. The native ISO range tops out at 25,600, and while the noise isn't as clean as the latest models, the images remain usable up to about ISO 6400 for handheld shots. I tested it on a dimly lit restaurant and was surprised at how much detail stayed in the shadows without having to crank the ISO to absurd levels. If you're comfortable working with a little post-noise reduction, the low-light results are solid for a camera that's nearly a decade old. One practical limitation that catches newcomers off guard is the lack of in-body image stabilization, IBIS. The A7 relies entirely on lens-based stabilization, meaning you need to pair it with OSS, optical steady shot, lenses if you want steady handheld video or low shutter speed stills. For someone who already has a collection of stabilized Sony E-mount lenses, that's fine. For a beginner starting from scratch, it adds an extra cost consideration because you'll have to buy stabilized lenses or a gimbal if you plan to shoot video. Speaking of video, the A7 records Full HD 1080p at up to 60 frames per second, which is decent for vloggers or hobbyists who don't need 4K. The video quality is clean, with good color rendition straight out of the camera, and the lack of rolling shutter makes fast pans fairly smooth. However, the absence of 4K means you'll quickly outgrow it if you decide to take your content to a more professional level. The Sony E-mount lens ecosystem is arguably the camera's biggest strength. Over the years, Sony, as well as third-party manufacturers like Sigma, Tamron, and Zeiss, have built an extensive lineup ranging from ultra-wide to super telephoto. Because the A7 is a body-only offering, you have the flexibility to mix and match lenses without being locked into a kit. That said, the best low-light and stabilization performance still lives in the more expensive G-Master lenses, which can be a budget hurdle. If you already own a few older E-mount lenses, you can use an adapter, but keep in mind that autofocus speed may drop further. Menu navigation on the A7 is a love-hate relationship. Sony's menu system is famously deep, and the A7 is no exception. The layout is divided into several layers of tabs and submenus that can feel overwhelming the first few times you turn the camera on. Once you learn the shortcuts assigning your favorite functions to the C1/C2 buttons, for example, the workflow becomes more fluid. For someone who enjoys tinkering and customizing settings, the menu offers a lot of depth. For a total beginner who just wants to point and shoot, it can feel like a steep learning curve. Battery confidence is modest but manageable. The NPF-W50 battery gives you roughly 350 shots per charge, which is lower than what you'd get from newer Sony bodies that use the larger NPF-Z100. In practical terms, a day of casual shooting on a single charge is realistic, but if you're planning a full-day wedding or a multi-hour outdoor shoot, you'll want at least one spare battery on hand. So, who should buy the Sony A7? If you're a hobbyist photographer who wants the look and feel of a full-frame sensor without breaking the bank,